I almost didn't buy the kit. This is where I keep returning, though. What it almost was, 2 steps away from not knowing. The one that comes in bright little packaging, with a tube and promises to tell you where you were from. And I had been avoiding as it was my 34th birthday. One of those cute little DNA ancestry kits. Put it away for 3 months in the kitchen drawer because I didn't think it'd help me. I knew where I was from. I was from a single wide on the east side of town, with a mother who worked double shifts in a diner without breaking a sweat. From a childhood that was lean but staunch and nobody's big idea of a dynasty. I knew where I was coming from. The kit seemed like a question I had not asked, so I opened it on a Tuesday night in March as part of my $40 humiliation experiment, but mostly because no one else was home and I was bored and kind of depressed, the way that your birthday sometimes makes you feel at 34 years old and alone all weekend in your apartment. And because the only thing less attractive than not opening this box was continuing to see the unopened, ugly brown cardboard box filling in out my peripheral vision for fucking 3 months running. I swabbed my cheek. I mailed it. Then I forgot about it for 3 weeks. On a Thursday, the results arrived. I read that email at lunch, seated alone in the corner of the office cafeteria, over a sandwich which I did not taste. Ancestry percentages were as expected, nothing shocking, nothing I needed a kit to feel. Then I clicked to view the relatives. The DNA matches. The people to whom the database had linked my sample. There was a close match. Not a cousin, not a distant relative. The title that the site uses for the strongest connection you can have outside of a parent or sibling. A half-sibling. The database reports that one such person shares something like 1/4 of my DNA. Someone called JB, and I had to read it twice because names on screens can swim. Someone called Victoria Calloway. I didn't know that name. I sat with my sandwich and looked at it and rolled it over in my head like a rock. I did get nothing. Victoria Calloway. A stranger who was, with the most exact technology human beings have yet created to know this sort of thing, my half-sister, which meant that we had a parent in common. And the parent we hadn't talked about, I knew mine, had always known her. She was home right now, 3 states away, probably getting her station ready for the dinner rush. The parent we'd never discussed was also, after 34 years of living, not counting the time Paul spent as an egg, findable. Not a blank. The silence my mother had kept so deep that had been held together with perfect care for 40 years until I no longer knew it as silence but saw it simply as the shape of our life. That evening, I messaged Victoria Calloway on the platform. Something short. Hello. I think we might be related. I don't want to intrude. If you are not in the mood to chat, then that's all right too. She didn't respond that night. Not the next day. I told myself it was fine. I reminded myself that the kit had been left in the drawer for 3 months too. Most people take longer. She replied on her 3rd day. 1 line. She said, "I think you have need to call me in." We talked for 40 minutes. Her voice was careful and strange, as if they stood on a floor not sure would hold. She told me her dad died 8 months ago. She told me his name. When I heard his name, what I did is something I want to share with you because I think it matters. I jotted it down on the back of an envelope like you'd write something that you're worried you'll forget, even though there was no way in hell that I'd ever forget. I pressed the pen hard, as if the pressure would render it more true. Richard Calloway. If you have ever been given a name that rearranged your entire past in the breath it took to say, like patriarchy or abortion, sit with me. Because the name was attached to a man I had never met, who had died 8 months before I cared enough to open a box sitting in the kitchen drawer, and to what came up when I Googled him on my phone with trembling fingers, was someone that didn't feel like a stranger. What I saw was a face that had been boringly staring blankly at me my entire life, not knowing it. A mirror I had never held up to a face. As I write this to you now, my hands are steady. Yet, on that Thursday evening, I sat cross-legged on my apartment floor with my back against the couch and my phone in my lap, and a name on an envelope. And at 34 years old, I had just discovered myself. And who I was, who I had been all along and never knew, was the daughter of a $200 million man who had died without putting my name on a single piece of paper. 6 days later, the family he left behind learned I existed. And so nothing about this was going to be quiet or easy or nice from that point on. Let me take you back, not to Richard Calloway world. I will, I swear, every square inch of it. Bring you back to where I really began, to the trailer, to her. For the woman who hid this secret so well, for so long that I had forgotten what it was like to know there was a secret at all. The trailer was white once. When I was nearly old enough to notice it was the color of yellowed paper, a kind of respectable vanilla that my mother insisted on calling classic. She was like that, had a name for everything, and made it something better than it was. It was on her skirting that she kept, not a garden, but an outdoor sitting room. The secondhand couch wasn't secondhand, it was gently used. Those were not hardship shifts at the diner, they were keeping busy. I was raised in the dictionary of a woman who had elected, long before I arrived on Earth, the tale that she would tell of her life, since she was going to be proud. Her name is Diane. She was 22 when I was born, and for as long as I can remember, she has been the most competent person in any room. Not loud about it, not capable of the kind that announces its presence, that sort that just sends every such fact into the world, bills paid 2 days ahead of their deadlines, uniform washed and ironed on the night before a presentation, a birthday cake from scratch, even in those years when scratch was literally all we had. She made our life seem like a deliberate selection of existence. That was the highest gift from her to me. I always thought anything we did not have was never deprivation. I understood it as ours. The one subject on which my mother was not warm, not engaging, not the woman who had a gracious word for everything. A door to a room in our house that not only was closed, but apparently had no handle on my side. My father. Who he was, where he was, if he knew me or wanted to know or even thought about me. I asked back when, I have no recollection of doing so, somewhere young, wordless, I seem to have learned that the question fell on my mother like a change in weather. Not mad, never mad, just a calm breeze that brushed through her and sealed something. And so I gave up asking the way children stop making requests that they know will not even move the person they love from standing in front of him to somewhere very far away, but still in body. Instead, like a child, I built explanations for myself. The whole library of them. He was just a kid, terrified, and left. He died long before I was born. A car accident, an illness, something neat and decisive. She was protecting me from him because he was dangerous. He was nothing, a mistake she had worked through and filed away. For years, I tried them all on like clothes in a shop you know you're not buying anything, just to see how it feels. None of them fit exactly, but the other way, the asking, watching her still go, was a greater price than with no closure. The one time I pushed. So I am 12, and there's one of those administration of a child forms, one of those lines for each parent, and I was at the kitchen table, dutifully filling it out, and I got to the line that said, father name. I need to put something. She was at the counter. Her initial reaction was not to come back, and when she did, her face had done the thing, where the weather changed and then there was no one home, and she looked at the form and she looked at me, and I saw something pass behind her eyes that I wasn't old enough to call. It wasn't grief exactly, or maybe grief with something else underneath it, something more ancient and more granular that I had no name for at 12, and she said, very delicately, "Just leave it blank, honey. It's okay to leave it blank." And that was it. I left it blank. and I tucked the question in to where I kept my library, in the place I had quit frequenting, and eventually matured out, and so moved away across 3 states into a life of my own, and quiet was all that met the question with distance. It didn't go away. Waves of questions like that don't disappear. Little do they know that these become easier to coexist with. I had published the kit and then almost called her the day I sent it off in the mail. I was at the mailbox and I had the box in my hand and I thought, call her first. Ask her first. It has her story too, and she may just tell you today. 34 years seems sufficient. And then I thought, if she wanted me to know, she'd have told me. The package in hand, I slid the box into the slot and walked back to my car. I didn't realize then that wanting had almost nothing to do with any of it, that it wasn't just her silence, that somebody else had purchased it, paid for it, and kept it up, administratively, as one might own a piece of real estate, paying taxes on the bare earth. I had no idea about any of that, though. I would, just not that afternoon. I am writing to you about the 30 seconds that exist between typing his name into a search engine and learning what came back, because those 30 seconds are the last time I was who I had been my entire life. After that, they were something different inside me. I don't mean that dramatically, I mean it exactly. There exists a before and after. Those 30 seconds are the doorway between them, and once you pass through a door like that, it will not swing back. So I Googled Richard Calloway, and I hit enter, and the results fell into place, and I parked myself down on my apartment's floor on a Thursday evening, and for once, out of the blue, I stopped being a woman who grew up in a trailer, but instead was now a woman who needed to grasp what she was looking at. The obituary came up first. A proper one, not a death notice, an obituary, the kind that runs in the business section of a national newspaper because this is a kind of man whose death has implications for markets. Richard Calloway, 71, founder and former chairman of Calloway Development Group, one of the southeastern United States' largest privately held real estate companies. Husband to Margaret, father to Victoria and Dominic. A memorial was held, donations in his honor, a photograph. Gazing at photo, I just sat and stared for a long time. In the photo, he was 60-something, graying hair, dressed in a suit that's worth more than a semester of the taxpayer-financed voucher program I attended, with his name on whatever building that is behind him, and that hand resting reassuringly on the shoulder of this kid. He had to be his son. He was smiling the practiced smile of a man who had stood in front of enough cameras to know where to angle his head. And beneath the forced smile and the gray hair and the suit, I had my mother's eyes but this man's jaw, his forehead, that unique positioning of the eyes, half a degree wider than average. I had been looking at parts of this face in mirrors and in photographs for my entire life, but never had a frame to put around them. I scrolled. I read everything that I could get my hands on. The Business Reporting brand, that company he built from the ground up, one residential development into an empire of commercial and residential properties that spanned 4 states since the 80s. The Giving, a hospital wing, a scholarship fund at the state university, a children's literacy program his wife chaired. The profile stories, the kind of faceless celebrity fluff journalists write about men who have kind of made it up there. A familiar rotation of just sitting in the same chair and answering some very basic questions and providing such an overwhelmingly planned circus sideshow with no takeaways, except for somewhere in every one of them there's literally just one single second where the operation leaks all over you, and what we're left with is maybe 5 total words that expose the raw humanness before he closes him back off. I read those moments with the rapt attention of a woman reading herself into the body of another, looking for what I'd inherited, what he had bared that I was bearing without knowing where it originated. Value at death, about $200 million. I noted that the company had gone into a trust run by the estate while the estate was still in probate, still being divided, still, technically, open. I want to be real with that moment because I think honesty is basically the only thing that makes a story like that worth telling. I noted it. The still in probate. I noted it like one takes note of a fact that has not yet formed into an idea. The sort your brain files under, "This is important, but I'm not sure how." In that instance, I was not doing arithmetic, and I stared at a photo on a screen of his jaw against my face. The math came afterward, and when it did come, it scared me, and then it stopped scaring me and began to seem like justice. That progression from fear to certainty is most of this tale. Well, anyway, I was able to stumble across Victoria's social media. She looked 38, 2 pictures away from exactly what you'd think the daughter of a man like Richard Calloway would look like. Right schools, right clothes, right parties. Beautiful, but somehow restrained, deliberate. My half-sister. The word sat strangely. Half of something. 50% of 34 years' worth. Not that I went without. Then I found the thing that made me put my phone down and sit in the dark. A news item. Small, archived, the kind of thing that only comes up if you're searching through and scrolling far back enough in time for the year. A society column from 35 years ago, the kind they used to print in small-town papers about local wealth, featuring a tiny photo and 2 sentences. Richard Calloway, up-and-coming star of the state development scene, announced his engagement to Margaret Elaine Forsyth during a dinner at her family's estate on Saturday. The couple's wedding is planned for spring. Dated 35 years ago. A few weeks shy of 9 months before I hit double digits. Before going further, let me stop and ask the question that I do over and over again. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Which city and which country? Drop it in the comments. And do tell, if you will. If a DNA test showed up tomorrow with the news that everything you thought you knew about your origins was mistaken, would you want to know? Would you open the box? Would you use it or let it sit in the drawer? So let's just break that down right now, bombshell behind me. Yes, open the box. Whatever awaits you inside of it, you can survive it. The place you will die is the not knowing. The not knowing just takes longer. You have read some of the stuff about Richard Calloway in October 2023. I want to be clear about what I was seeking because I knew it wasn't the money. At least not yet. Not in those first days. I was searching for something more primal and desperate. I started looking for the proof of this man. Not the business, not the charity, which is a form of performance all its own, the person. Because whatever I might do next depended, in part, not entirely logical, on whether the man that had contributed the DNA within me was worth a portion of what was to come. It's a funny thing what shows when you read the man in order to assess whether he was good. You turn into a sort of personal archaeologist, brushing away the veneer of public life, searching for what lies beneath, where the flesh peeks through managed presentation. I read every interview. I saw everything I could. A commencement address, a business conference panel, a following local news segment on one of his development projects to help provide jobs for the same town. I scanned the comments on his obituary, and you never know what crazy, honest things these strangers are going to say in an obituary comments section. Things people wouldn't dare say to the grieving family. What I discovered was the mixture and messiness of humans, which is complicated in the way that real people are complicated, which I appreciated. Oh, I didn't want to be a monster. It would have been easier, maybe. But I didn't want that. And I did not want a saint. Because saints do not get rid of pregnant ladies in their 20s. What I found was a man, pulled in the sense that the kind of people who create whole companies from a standing start get, meaning he would have also been hard to love at times. His public generosity, and from the anecdotal evidence of a few who had worked for him, his private ones too, there were comments about how he would appear in an employee's hospital room, how he'd quietly paid for someone's daughter's college tuition with no fanfare. Not performing goodness, just doing it. But there was something else. 3 profiles, separated through years and written by 3 different journalists representing various iterations of the same instant. Asked about his family, he responds immediately, warmly. Margaret, Victoria, Dominic. And then the silence in each interview. An offbeat the journalist had taken note of simply for being a touch behind time. The journalist wrote in one piece, "It appeared as though, for a moment, he was looking at something not in the room." In another, that silence, which indeed was something other than reflection, took on the calms of a memory. The third one had asked him point-blank near the end if he regretted anything, a question journalists always ask on such occasions, and Richard Calloway had replied levelly, "I have tried to do the right things by those who matter most. I haven't always succeeded. No one does. No one does." That sentence I have read numerous times. I interpreted it as a man who could see clearly how he failed in a particular way, and who had not entirely made peace with that. Maybe I was wrong, or perhaps it was just meaningless. Yet I have been reading people all my life with the eye of someone who was raised needing to read rooms fast, and they could not mean nothing. On the 5th day, I called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring, meaning she had been waiting. I said, "I read your father. Because he was her father, he had been her father all of her life, in every way a father should be, and I wasn't taking that from her even with linguistics. I need to ask you something. In the end, with only a few months to go, was he in search of something? Or someone?" There was a silence, the careful kind. Finally, Victoria said very slowly, "He got really quiet the last year. We thought the illness was it. He had many conversations with Gerald, out lawyer, that we were not privy to, and he—" She stopped, started again. "A few months before he died, I found him burning the midnight oil in his study with piles of old files on his table, boxes from storage. I asked what he was looking for, and he told me, something I should have sorted a long time ago. I didn't push. I wish I had. He was looking. He was searching in his last months. 8 months before the drawer is opened as I find the kit. 8 months. The next morning, Hargrove and Associates emailed. It was a 3-paragraph email and one of the most calculatedly hostile documents I have ever read. No mean feat considering that it ultimately contained nothing but perfectly polite words. Gerald Hargrove, Senior Partner, Department, Hargrove and Associates. Type, Legal Contact, 601-25 2nd Avenue. He was writing to inform them that they were aware of the DNA match brought to light through the Ancestry platform. He was writing to inform me, as a courtesy, that the estate was nearing its endpoint for probate, and any claims raised now would have significant legal and evidentiary roadblocks. He's writing basically to make sure I clear anything with my own attorney first, and he was writing, in the last paragraph, in such smooth language that it took me 3 readings to even spot the threat hidden inside. To note a family prepared vigorously to protect the integrity of the estate and probe the origins and motives of any claim. Examine the origins and motivations. I was the origin. Examining my motivation was apparently already a thing. And I set the email aside, and I asked myself whether this was anything more than vengeance. Because I had to be fair. Because I have always felt obliged to be fair, even at a tangible cost. This was a woman who had been married to that man for 35 years, who had shared 2 children with him, who had watched him get sick and watched him die, and who was now, 8 months into her grieving, she was under pressure from the idea of a stranger that could be his heir circling the estate. I mean, I wonder what that must feel like. I consider the version of this story where I am just the thing that comes in after a woman's worst year and tortures it. I maintained that version for some time because I think you must hold the version that makes you the culpable one before knowing that it's not. And then I put it down because the version of events where I was the problem demanded that I believe a thing that few facts actually seemed to back up. It asked me to believe that the question of who my father was and whether his estate had any responsibility to recognize me was a question about Margaret Calloway's grief. And it wasn't. It was a question about me, about who I was. which was about a 22-year-old girl signing herself away, sitting alone in a room I couldn't yet see. Dominic Calloway's released to a contact, a PR company, actually, if that tells you everything about how he was approaching this. His son Richard, at 40, almost old enough to have known his father for a good part of his life, described the DNA match as likely a database error, or, one less plausibly, a considered effort to exploit an aggrieved family. He used the word predatory. He called it a bad faith claim. Say it with both words, his name before the word attack. He wanted to be credited for the attacks because that meant he wasn't scared of it, because that meant they had been told they could win. Her silence again, Victoria. Not cool. She did not feel cold to me. I particularly missed someone who has been advised by her lawyer to have no comment and is currently complying with that direction. I called my mother. I had been putting it off. Not out of cowardice. From a kind of consideration for her I doubted she deserved and gave her anyway. Because she was my mother and I loved her, and the conversation that we needed to have was going to cost us both dear. I waited until I could ask a real question that had sufficient fact rather than just spontaneously bleeding on her on the phone. I dialed. Her voice was warm and ordinary, the voice of a woman expecting her usual Thursday morning chit-chat with her daughter. "Mom," I said, "I am going to tell you something, and then you are going to write back and tell me something." I told her about the kit, the match, Victoria, the name. For the first time, I said it aloud, to another living, breathing human being. Richard Calloway. Mom, was Richard Calloway my dad? That was the longest I ever sat in silence afterwards. Longer than every single wait for any test result. More than any night at a hospital. The particular silence of a woman who's been breath-held for 34 years, who has just, at fucking last, been asked to exhale. And then she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "How asked you the name?" Not, "That's not right. Nice. I'm not sure what you're referring to." Just, "How did you find it?" Present tense, as if the name itself were a physical object, as though it were at some place in time and space, waiting for her to need it again, and that she needed to know how I had arrived there. And that single question in that one voice was the answer I had been looking for. Because daughter calling the wrong man has 100 possible responses. And when she names the correct one, whom you've hidden from for 34 years, and you need to know, really, how the walls fell at last. The story broke on a Monday. No idea how, a leak from the probate filings, tipped to a journalist or Calloway PR purposely ceding the ground as it were before I could. It doesn't matter how. The point being is that I woke up to 17 missed calls on a Monday morning and an alert saying that my name was in the headline of a Society column reading, "Mystery Woman Claims Part of Calloway Fortune." They had my name. They had my employer. They had the neighborhood where I grew up. Best of all, they did not know my address, but they could provide enough that someone sufficiently motivated could figure it out. And the internet has no shortage of people who are sufficiently motivated when there is money to be made with a story involving a woman who just might be getting it on. The messages began flooding in before 9 o'clock. A lot of them were the usual. Strangers who feel empowered to share their opinions with a lady they don't know about issues that decide this lady's future. Fewer than those came from people who experienced something similar, something adjacent, who wrote to say, "I see you. What happened to me too. Don't let them win." I held on to those. I still have them. I went to work. What else do you do? All of this while, a legal battle I did not initiate roared into being around my name. But my rent was still due. My bills didn't pause. I donned clothing, I went to my desk, and sat in front of my computer like someone who lived a normal life. Because I was someone that lived a normal life. And contrary to what the column insisted, an interest in a dead man's estate was not the entirety of me. 10:30, I was called into my manager's office. He was not unkind, and it's worth saying he really wasn't cruel. and I think he really was uncomfortable with what he had to tell me. He said the company received calls, 2 from reporters and 1 from what he called a representative of the Callaway estate, who noted concerns about a possible conflict because there is an open suit. In my case, it was not a conflict of interest. I toiled in communications for a mid-sized regional firm that had zero involvement with Callaway Development Group. But the call had been made. The call was made, so the message was the call. And that Gerald Hargrove had deemed making my career really difficult, a tactic worth employing, and then did so in less than 72 hours after learning of my existence. My manager suggested I go on leave while we sorted some stuff out, and he used the expression, "while things calm down." I wondered what it would look like to let things cool over, to hold still, in silence, while the machine came around to finish its task. While a column did time on its way into the next story, and Dominic Callaway splayed out my name under that word, predatory. I envisioned the woman who had been waiting her whole adult life for this rap, and my mother saying, "How did you find that name?" "No," I said. "I don't need a leave of absence. I need what happens after that. Thank you." That afternoon, Gerald Hargrove's company moved proactively at the probate court. I was notified by the court. The motion asserted that the consumer ancestry site, DNA Match, did not meet state heirship requirements and was suspiciously timed, given how close we were to closing on the estate. That I, as claimant, had never tried to establish a relationship with my late uncle. That last part arrived the way it was intended to arrive, like something that was on me, as if I was supposed to have introduced myself to my father at some moment in those 34 years when he had no job title. Whereas, when they did notice the comments under the online column, by evening they'd discovered a new angle. Why didn't she come forward when he was alive? As if I had known. As if I had sat on this for decades and waited until the most conveniently inopportune moment. And as if I had always known and chose to withhold. That night, I was alone in my apartment staring at the court filing on my screen, and the column next to it in another tab, and 17 messages I hadn't answered yet. And I did what I've always done when the world becomes noise. I got very quiet. I got very still. And I discovered the core of me. In a female voice, I knew my mother had said, "How did you come up with that name?" in response to something within, knowing the name was true. In the final months of his life, Richard Callaway had been rifling through stacks in his study, searching for something he should have put to rest years ago. I had a pretty good idea from a DNA test connecting me to his daughter that nothing, least of all some PR flack or probate brief or column, was going to undo. Then Gerald Hargrove called my cell. My personal number, which I had provided to no one involved in this. He was smooth. He was pleasant. Asked when she would submit her complaint, he said, "Ms., you have the same intelligence as a goat, and I'm going to ask you again, one more time, as a favor. Walk away from this. You have no clue what you are getting into." I was quiet for a moment, and I was like, "So why does it feel like you do?" He hung up. That was when I went from being scared to being sure. That a man who calls your very cell phone to holler at you to walk away is a man who, quietly, does not believe he can beat you in court. And a man with access to things he shouldn't have, who could tell my home number for no person involved had the opportunity of what Gerald Hargrove knew, and when and why/not, was more compelling than I'd yet realized. I need a lawyer, I thought. A real one. Mine. That weekend I took a drive to see her. 3 states, 6 hours, the same route I'd driven 100 times, but never with this in my car with me. Never with a name on an envelope stuffed into my jacket pocket, an emotion attached to my phone. And 34 years of something that was finally about to be settled, no matter how prepared either of us would ever feel. As I was driving into the driveway, she had been on the porch. She was aware I would arrive, I had called, but she wasn't sure when. And I had arrived before she could prepare too much, before she could lay out the architecture of what she would and wouldn't say, and what she'd defend. Years of practice walked her into the room. I needed to grab her in the mundane, how she actually was. She looked the same. That's the thing I notice most, how much my mother looks like my mother as she's always looked, but also because years sit differently on those who bear something heavy, that carrying OI and aging almost don't go together. Alan. She was tiny and skinny, and the gray hair had been dark for ages, just as the face did three things in quick succession when she saw me coming up the porch steps: love, fear, and complicated relief. A person who has so tired of carrying something and finally granted a reprieve to let go. We sat at our kitchen table. She brewed coffee. She always brews coffee. Her hands needed something to do when her mouth does the hard work. And I set the envelope with his name on it down on the table between us and said, "Tell me." She didn't cry. I want you to know that. Crying is not the thing my mother does. Not in front of anyone, about anything. It has been the one luxury she never allowed herself, and even now, at the moment she'd feared, but half wanted for 34 years together, she would not allow herself to cry. She just sat there across the table, and she looked at the name on the envelope. That was at a time when she was already 22 years old. He was 36, in the process of building something, becoming the man back when they would write his obituary. She waitressed at a place he walked into 2 times a week. Not the type of place where a man like that just might happen to stroll through, but where a man like that goes when he wants to be somewhere no one is keeping an eye on him. They talked. In her usage, they spoke. As if talking could have been the entire thing. However, the talking continued for 7 months, and she was 22 and in love in the way that only a 22-year-old can be in love. Heart first, brain last. Absolutely and without any of the structural reinforcements experience reconstitutes itself to provide. But what she didn't know, what no one told her until years later with an implied disgust mixed with faux sympathy, was that Richard Calloway had been engaged to Margaret Forsyth throughout all 7 months. She learned about the engagement in the same week she learned about me. I want you to be clear what that is. To be not even 23 yet and carrying the child of a man who thought you were his whole world, just to understand that he had another life you knew nothing about. It's a kind of discovery that I don't think anyone who hasn't been through it can understand. The way it doesn't just damage you in this current moment, but rewrites all those 7 months worth of memories to be something else. So that the mourning is not simply about now, but about all of them. Every single second we thought we knew what was happening, only to find out a few months later it had been something else. She called him. She told him. And he came. Now that was important to her. Still meant something, she said so, like it was her duty to be fair to someone you didn't owe fairness, but would give it anyway because that was who she was. He came. They talked, badly and at infinite length, in the parking lot of a Waffle House at 2 a.m. About how one says the thing which should be said when no space can contain it. He was not cruel, she said. He was not cold. And he was a man in the very particular terror of one who has built a life on something nothing can hold, seeing that something buckling. He said he would handle it. He said he would call her. He said, and here she paused, her hands stilled on the coffee cup. He said he was sorry, that he never meant for her to get hurt, that he would make it right. He didn't call. Gerald Hargrove called instead. 32 years old when he called my mother, this Gerald Hargrove, which was 22 years younger than he was at the time. Young, but already the voice. She described it exactly as I would have described it myself, having experienced him. Smooth, agreeable, and beneath the agreeableness, something like a closed door. He told he was calling in behalf of Richard Calloway. He understood, he said, that she was in a tough position. I was sure that he could find a way they would all be happy. He sent a car to pick her up. Her quote, "She had gone because she was 22 and alone, without a lawyer. She claimed to not have known that she needed one, and because Gerald Hargrove would like to meet with you, sounds when you're 22 and scared an awful lot like something you don't say no to." He had rendezvoused with her in a conference room. A woman was there too, a witness, although my mother didn't know what word to call it then. He put papers on the table. He explained them, how lawyers explain things to people they correctly determine have no lawyers. Enough that it seemed fair, and enough that the incomplete descriptions elided what wasn't. The agreement stated she would not name Richard Calloway the father of her child on any legal document. She would not call him, his family, his business partners, or even his attorneys. She wouldn't comment about the relationship with any third party. In return, she would receive a small amount of money, not a lot of money, not even enough money for someone who lived in the same income level as the world that Hargrove operated in would call comfortable, but a sum that was amounts to more than this 22-year-old waitress had ever held on to all at once before, because she had been about to give birth like any other day with no family support behind her. Hitting 4 figures, enough to secure a place to live, and be able to survive the first year. She signed it. She still has never stopped regretting signing it. I had known that before she spoke the words, I could read it in her posture when she said it, as if she'd steeled herself for a judgment she'd been preparing for since ink dried. And I want to say, as I did then across that kitchen table, because only a few years later this needs to be on the record, she was 22 years old, alone with a man who for his entire professional life has built his whole business around making people sign things they shouldn't sign. She propped up her belly with her arms on that hospital couch and was so poor and without a lawyer. She was not weak. She was out of options. It is a distinction, and an important one, and I will spend the rest of my life making it, if need be. What she didn't know, what Gerald Hargrove had gone to great lengths to keep out of the papers, was that Richard Calloway hadn't really understood the terms. For years, she assumed that he did know, that the deal was his idea, his answer, and his method of erasing the issue. She came to describe it, the call that had never come after the parking lot, as his decision, as him picking Margaret and his life and his company over her and I. And she had carried it for 34 years, wore it silently, with her head held high, in a single-wide trailer she termed classic, to assemble birthdays from nothing and write on school forms where it should have read Beirut. Believing that he had known and chosen to leave us there. She had been mistaken in that regard, but she wouldn't find out until I discovered the letter, weeks later, in a study of a house she'd never seen, folder after folder that Gerald Hargrove thought was buried. Not that I had mentioned that part to her yet. So, sitting at the kitchen table that day, I let her finish. I waited until she had reached the end of the story that she had been carrying, a version of events as it made sense to her, and then, when she was finished, I stretched across the table and clasped her hands, those capable, everything-making, double-shift hands, and said, "I am not angry with you. I need you to hear that. What happened? I'm not mad at you." She looked at me and her level chin and said, "I'm mad at myself, but thank you." We sat there for a while. The coffee went cold. The garden she kept along the skirting was blooming some yellow and determined through the window, the way it always did, what she had always been able to manage. "The agreement," I said finally. "Do you still have it?" She nodded. "I need it," I said, "because what Hargrove did to you 34 years ago is the same thing he's trying to do to me right now. And this time, there's going to be a lawyer in the room." Her name was Sandra Reyes, and a friend of someone who had, in the parlance of the moment, experienced an adjacent something, fight institutional money with personal truth. Need someone on your side who had done it before, successfully, had recommended her. I called but did my homework on it. Sandra came with 20 years of estate litigation experience, a record not without bull rings, no one's is, but distinguished by the character of who she represented. Cases in which the odds were rigged against her client right from the outset. You know, the ones where the other side figures they can win just by resources. She had an unimpressive office and a reputation that was anything but. In 12 minutes, she had read the lay of the land. How do I know this? Because I timed it. Nervous situation and timing things felt like something for my mind to grasp while she sorted through what I'd brought her. The DNA match documentation, the Ancestry platform's relationship designation, Hargrove's office court filing, the column, the email, the call to my employer. It was a verbatim note I had made of Hargrove's personal cell phone call. She read it all, expressionlessly, and then put it down and looked at me over her reading glasses, the way people look at something they're trying to figure out how to feel about. "He was calling your personal cell number," she said. "Yes. That's that number. How did he have that?" "I have the same question." She made a note. She stated, "That's not a pro-move call, Alaska. That's a pressure call. He wanted the fright into you before you thought about seeking counsel. It means he's done this sort of thing before, or something almost like it." She tapped the court filing. "This motion is meant to delay the process. They are fully aware that the DNA evidence is clear. A consumer platform match on its own wouldn't stand up in court, but it provides the basis for a legitimate legal challenge, and they cannot prevent you from asking. They can make it expensive and slow. That's the play." She set her glasses down. "I understand your mother signed an agreement." She did, 34 years ago, before a conference room without an attorney present. Sandra's expression remained unchanged, but the quality of her attention became razor sharp. "Do you have it?" "She does. I'm getting it." "Good. A pregnant woman with no legal representation who signed an NDA under financial duress and for less than market. Not bulletproof. That's tissue paper. And Hargrove knows it, which is likely why he'd prefer to strong-arm you into moving on than work this thing through a courtroom." Her hands were folded over the desk. "So let me ask the question I always ask at the beginning because it defines how we go forward. What do you want from this? Just the financial acknowledgement? A legal finding of paternity? A public record? Or do you want all of it?" I thought about it, really considered it, which I had not allowed myself to do before. The money was theoretical, the number too great to be an actual number in a real life. What did I want? I said, "I want the truth on the record. Officially. I want a judge to determine who my dad was. The money part, I'll let the court handle that. But I want his name, somewhere legal, with mine." Sandra nodded. "The cleanest answer I've heard in 2 decades, she said. "The one that actually opens every door as well. After the paternity question is settled, if we do thus establish it legally of a person who is still alive. You understand that?" I said I understood. "So we exercise a petition for heirship determination," she said. "We ask for a court-mandated DNA comparison utilizing a biological specimen from the estate. There will be medical specimens preserved, there always are, we'll subpoena them. And we let the DNA speak. Hargrove's entire case relies on the narrative control. We are going to remove his story from him and place it in the hands of a lab." For the first time since that Thursday in the cafeteria, I walked out of Sandra's office into the afternoon light, feeling like maybe this ground under my feet was real. Not safe. I still wasn't safe. Not yet. Nothing like it. But solid. There's a difference. Safety is the absence of threat. Solid is the idea of knowing where you are standing. I knew what I was standing you on. A DNA examination, a mother's signed coercion form, and a lawyer who had been anticipating what, apparently, debated precisely such a tussle. Walking to my car, I almost didn't purchase the kit, I thought. It almost stayed in the drawer. 6 weeks into the litigation, they noticed the deposition for a Tuesday morning. It was a standard procedural car wash request for Hargrove's team, Sandra said. An opportunity. One reason I would be cooperating fully, and why I would need to tread very carefully. I want to remind you of preparing for that morning, not about the clothes or the makeup, and I spent more time than usual thinking about both, knowing that I would be seen and judged, and that whatever I wore would tell part of the story to whomever it is they sought to define me. I want to tell you about the 20 minutes I spent sitting in my car in the parking garage before I went inside, just sitting there with my hands resting on my thighs and my eyes closed, practicing what I learned at a particular school, waiting for quiet before the storm. I had nothing to hide. And that is the thing I clung to for those 20 minutes. I had never actually met Richard Calloway. Prior to the match that happened with DNA, I had never reached out to his family. In this journey, I had done nothing but opened a box given to me for my birthday by a friend and followed the truth flowing from it. Not manipulated any database, fabricated no evidence. I had nothing to hide. The question was simply whether I could keep that certainty against a room designed to embed nothing but doubt. Hargrove's procedural partner through the deposition was a man in his mid-30s, young for the suit, engaged with precision only as weapons-grade people use precision. He started off the routine questions. Anyway, I told them I lived in... Did they need to know my name, my age, what I do for a living? How am I related to the dead person? None, said me. No relation, nor had met him. The agency that reported the DNA match will confirm and corroborate from data from the hands of the petition to file a petition. The timeline of events. Each question came out of his mouth as if he thought the answer was set up for more drama than I had given it. And still, my response to each was clean, straight into the near silence untouched by conversation now, just like Sandra instructed it. Answer what is asked, not what is implied. And then he got to where they were all building to. He asked about my finances, my salary, my savings, my debt, things he somehow already knew, because the number I read aloud matched the number he'd written down before I said it, which meant someone had done their homework. He said whether I was financially struggling. I said I was not. He inquired if I had spoken to any person or agency regarding the value of the Calloway estate prior to filing petition. I said I had not. He wanted to know if, before the DNA match, I had any knowledge or interest in the Calloway family or their estate. No, I said. You had never heard of Richard Calloway before DNA linked him to the case? No. And yet, I pause the way they do, for effect while checking my notes, you have lived and worked in the last 4 years within 12 miles of a Calloway development property. You have gone to a gym in the same complex. You had no idea it was tied to the name Calloway? I did not know that I was related to the Calloway by marriage, yes. Up until that time, I had no idea who my biological father was. Convenient, he said, not as a question. Slight pull of his head, as a statement. Sandra said calmly, "Strike that." He moved on. For the next 40 minutes, he approached that same point from 4 different angles, suggesting each time, in slightly more elaborate ways, that it was suspicious timing. It was a claim motivated by money the estate would fetch for someone with such a right of inheritance. And they surely could not be serious when they claimed this woman had never even heard her father's name, until she coincidentally came to light just when proving paternity would bring a breakthrough in frontline legal expense. I answered exactly the same every time. Every time Sandra spoke up only when necessary, and then only to enforce the limits of what is appropriate in a deposition, which is the sign of someone who knows what a deposition actually is. And then, towards the end, everything changed. He wanted to know what my mother had said about my father before the DNA match, and I told him, literally nothing. She would not talk about it. And he replied smoothly, "So how do you explain your mother's signature on a contract that proved full knowledge of the private nature of her relationship with the deceased? He had the NDA. Or he was aware of it, certainly mindful of its contents. It was AMMO for him that the relationship had been common knowledge, that the silence was a decision, and therefore my sudden discovery is debatable." I looked at him for a moment, and finally I said, very quietly, "I explain it as my mother, newly 22, signing that negotiation in a conference room with no counsel physically coerced. Finally, I note that the agreement was prepared by Gerald Hargrove. I paused. I would like to know when Mr. Hargrove first became aware of my existence. The associate stopped writing. Just for a second. Just long enough. Sandra made a note. Later, in the hall, that last question, where did that come from? I said there was something wrong about Hargrove. He called my personal number. He was aware of the NDA straight away. He is not merely the estate's lawyer. He has been sitting on this particular secret for some time. I want to know since when. Sandra stared me down for several long moments. So do I, she said. I got a call from Victoria 3 weeks following the deposition on a Wednesday night. Private number, she was cautious. It was the same deliberate voice from our initial call, but somehow something had shifted under that carefulness. A decision, taken. The voice of someone at the end of what they would protect. I have something to say to you, she said. I'm doing this not because I am not scared. I need you to understand that. I am afraid. And I became that, even though my father was dying in those last months, with everything packed in boxes and hoping to find something he said he'd meant to go through long ago. But I can't help thinking of what he was looking for. I didn't say anything. I gave her the space to arrive there. He was searching for you, she said. Not by name. He didn't know your name. But he knew you existed. I think he'd always known. And I think that in the last year of his life, he was aware that he was dying, and he wanted to do something, to try to change things, to fix it. Gerald kept saying it was too late, that opening it all up would be a horrible mess and painful for him and harmful to the family. Gerald talked Dad into everything. He always had. For 30 years, Gerald had handled every hard thing in our family. Dad trusted him completely. A pause. Too completely. I asked her what she meant. You are programmed with data until October 2023. After he died, I found his study. Not for any reasons, just that I had to be in the room which was most his. You know what I mean. I found a letter in the bottom drawer of his desk, in a folder embossed with a date, 30 years past, in his handwriting. Directed to a woman named Deanne. The air went dead still around me. Victoria said, it was never sent. It had never been in an envelope. It was folded, in the folder. He'd written it and kept it. And in the letter, he mentioned a child, about wanting to find out, about being told it was taken care of and doubting he believed that. He said he was told she agreed to a clean break and would not welcome in contact. And he said, her voice snagged, just a little. And he said he didn't think that was true either. He said he thought about it. Some things never sit right no matter how many years pass, he said. She stopped. I could hear her both gaining composure. He's like, who said she agreed to a clean break? I said, though I already knew. Gerald, Victoria said. Gerald told him. Gerald handled it. For 3 decades, he told my father the woman had opted to go end contact, that chasing it would only create a state of unnerving refusal. And my father? Her voice took on a strangled, dark complexity, a helpless grief shot with anger and love and all the permutations thereof. My father believed him, because he always believed Gerald. When Gerald had to deal with the difficult things in our family even before I was born, I let that sit. Victoria, I said, would you stand in front of a judge and say such? A long pause. Her longest message since she first reached out. You probably ought to call me. Yes, she said. I would. Apologies for taking me so long to get back to you. I'm sorry for all of it. Let me pause and ask you the question I asked in 1,000 different ways throughout this story, because it was a question I kept coming back to over and over again at every intersection. So if you were Victoria, the authentic daughter, the one who had it all growing up, who stood to lose the most by exposing this truth, would you have called? Would you have contacted the stranger who was about to inherit a part of your real estate? Tell me down below. I genuinely want to know. Because here's what I feel, as one who got that call from her. What she did takes more courage than anything I did. I had nothing to lose. She had everything. And she called anyway. The following morning, Sandra subpoenaed the letter. Desk drawer. A physical thing by itself, it does not disappear casually, in a house, in a room, date-stamped folder. And once Victoria told us it existed and testified she would testify as to how she found it, Hargrove's team had two choices: produce or explain where. It was worse than the letter, so they made it. The estate's lawyers supplied a scanned copy. They printed it for me. I read it for the first time in Sandra's conference room on a Thursday afternoon. It was an evidence now also of the original. This was the right thing to say. Yet Sandra did not. I am not going to read you the entire letter. It is part of him, this man I have never known, who put his thoughts down on paper and stuck it in a drawer for 30 years, only to die without knowing if perhaps somebody, the good Lord? But I'm going to tell you what it contained, because it is the heart of all things, the axis and pivot point and center of gravity for this whole story so far. And you deserve a center. He wrote in when I was 4 years old, 30 years ago. He said he'd seen something, not what, in the letter, just something that reminded me, the way people are careful even when there's no one but a page to read them, and it had made my mother return to him. He wrote that he had asked Gerald if the arrangement had been, he used the term, fair, the last time it had been fair to her. Gerald has told him it had, that she'd been paid off to go away, that she was putting it behind her and had no wish for further contact, that dragging the whole thing up again would be cruel to all parties. And Richard Calloway had handwritten in a letter he never sent. I don't know if I believe that. I know Diane, or I knew her. No way she was the kind of woman that would shut a door without checking first to see if it was proper to close it. For 4 years, I wondered if the door was closed by her or for her. Gerald advises me that I should leave it alone. Gerald is usually right. Yet somehow this feels wrong, and I don't think it ever will. He had known. Not with the certainty of evidence, but rather the certainty of knowing a person, even one you had known for only 7 months, to know a person in a way that does not require documentation. He knew my mom's silence was not entirely her own. That was 30 years ago, and he'd written privately questioning it. Then he had put the letter into a drawer and shut up and listened to Gerald Hargrove instead. In Sandra's conference room, I sat with that for a long time. I thought of the man rifling through 50 boxes in his study his last months, searching for something he insisted he should have settled decades ago. I wondered about the burden of a question that a person has had to carry that they did not answer for 30 years. All the double shifts felt like a choice, as I thought of my mother, up there in her garden along the skirting. 2 people, 100 miles, and a world apart, each with the same question heading opposite directions, and between them a lawyer who had spent 30 years making sure they never found your way to one another. I put the letter down. I looked at Sandra. I said, Gerald Hargrove told Richard Calloway for 30 years that my mother didn't want anything to do with contacting me. And he told my mother for 30 years, through the silence, through the passing of time, through the whole architecture of an NDA, that Richard had decided to go. They had no idea what each other had been told. He kept both of them in the dark, separately. Yes, Sandra said. That's more than just malpractice, I told her. That's? No, she said carefully. Let's not name it yet. Let's make it, in court, what it clearly is. A conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty and intentional interference with the contract and business relationship between people who have an interest in communicating with each other. She paused. But yes, it is also what you think. I nodded. How do we use it? I asked. Sandra explained. We use it to answer the question you posed at your deposition. When did Gerald Hargrove discover you? According to this letter, the answer is prior to your birth. He has kept this secret longer than your entire life, and that alters the character of this whole proceeding. There exists a type of villain in such stories as this one. Not the sort that declares itself, not the kind who strides upon the stage twirling something device, announcing its intent. The more durable kind, that which makes up a career based upon trust, the ability to be trusted, or being that person in the room that simply knows what no one else does and how to use it as architecture. A framework to sustain a family, a cage that also, by necessity, contains the family. He had met my mother when he was 32 years old. He was 66 now. 34 years of dealing with the Calloway family's tricky stuff. 34 years of being, in the words of Richard Calloway, the man who took care of it, said his daughter quoted him to me. 34 years of a secret that did not belong to him, but one which he kept nevertheless. And the question was why? And the answer to why, when Sandra finally put it together, was both simpler and more full than I expected. The easy one. Gerald Hargrove had been the broker for the Calloway family's first large commercial asset sale, the deal that gave Richard a regional operation with actual scale. The commission had been substantial. But this makes more than that. It had been the backbone of a law firm. It was the Calloway account that had made Gerald Hargrove. Not modestly, completely. His company, his name and credibility, his life, all had been built on the stones of Calloway Development Group, and all had remained firmly planted upon those same stones for 35 years. He was not just the attorney for the family. He was, professionally, their creation. A child Richard Calloway recognized, a child with an inherited interest in the estate of her late father, represented a danger to the Calloway family and to Gerald Hargrove himself. Not in the dramatic sense, in the structural sense. The estate that was complicated by another heir, the probate that continued to be contested, the family's finances dissected, even the circumstances of that original NDA, all those were tests of Gerald's own doing, his own choices. From his own 34 years of managing something which he, at the age of 32, had made manageable. Financial trails, unlike conversations, save traces. And Sandra followed that trail. Hargrove had invoiced the estate of Calloway for what his invoices referred to as matter resolution, a euphemism so aggressively vague it could be anything, which is the point of writing phrases like that. The invoices were for 3 different times: the year I was born, the year I turned 4, the same year that Richard had written his letter, and the year of my 18th birthday, the year I turned 18. Essentially, that meant that when I was coming into my legal adulthood and figuring out what rights I might possess beyond a theoretical level, Gerald Hargrove was on the Calloway estate payroll to keep those rights invisible. He did not just leave the letter buried 30 years ago. He had tended the burial, regularly, professionally, on the clock. Sandra made this filing that I read in her office on a gray Tuesday morning in October 2023. The filing requested Gerald Hargrove to recuse from representing the estate in the paternity petition due to not disclosing a conflict of interest, and for perhaps being involved in bearing evidence. She included the attached letter, record of her testimony, records of billing, and Victoria's message under oath. I had spent weeks picturing Hargrove's response, the coolly professional tone of a man who has been handling hard things for 34 years and thinks he can handle one more. The call on my phone that says courtesy, the deposition's angles and implications. This was just the confidently churning machine of a dude who had yet to come across a room he couldn't work. Sandra submitted 2 days after he recused himself, January 12th, September 2018, no statement, no explanation, only notice through the court that he would no longer serve as counsel for the estate. New attorney for the Calloways, Margaret and Dominic, younger, without 34 years of entangled history. Lawyers who had examined the file and witnessed what Sandra had assembled and understood, well, as lawyers do, the terrain had shifted on its head. They were no longer being paid to win. They had to lose their way. Dominic was not graciously about it. For about 2 weeks, his PR shop put out a string of statements that became increasingly unhinged and personal, concluding with one in which he called me a DNA tourist, trying to make money rewriting the history of this family. By then, I had stopped reading them, not out of being hurt, but by the realization that the public statements were designed for an audience other than me, and that what would happen at trial was not going to be dictated by this audience's opinion of me. Let him talk. That's a question the case would answer better than me. Margaret said nothing publicly. Those 14 days I spent thinking about her non-stop. I still do. It is one of those sorrows of being married to someone for 35 years and finding, in the legal cleanup after his death, that there had been room in his life you did not know about. Not an affair, precisely. That would be at least an active relationship. More like a history, another person, a child, a letter in a drawer. As for me, I do not know what Margaret felt. I have my guesses, but she, in the end, was the one who did not fight. She allowed her new lawyers to handle the procedural work. Her next comment never came. And at some point, through a go-between, she sent word that she had read the letter, Richard's letter to my mother, and she'd not challenged the paternity test. That was the only part of the whole event that came close to anything resembling grace, and I have never gotten over it. The DNA comparison was ordered by the court on a Thursday. It was the day I remember specific poorly because of the weather. An unremarkable fall morning cloaked in a gray blanket threatening rain. One of those days that does not shout anything important, feeling right. In fact, the big days in this story had rarely introduced themselves. This was in a cafeteria during some March Thursday when I opened an email. Somewhere on a Saturday afternoon in a porch of an average place. One Wednesday night, picking up a private number on my phone. From the outside, the days that change everything look like all the other days. The proceeding involved a ruling on the subpoena of Richard Calloway's medical records. Years before he died, he had undergone a major cardiac surgery. Tissue samples were routinely stored from the procedure for possible future medical reference. The samples were at a hospital facility and had been there since that procedure. No, they have realized Gerald Hargrove had never been anywhere close to them. People who had neither been managed or maintained nor quietly attended to by anyone with an interest in what they might say. They were just an entry, storing on a medical file for whatever use you might give it. I submitted my sample on the same day the order from court was issued. Another clinical setting, another nurse, another swabs, all the jargon of this narrative yet again. I have performed these others a few times now, and every time it is the precise same little ritual. Cotton on the inside of the cheek, careful writing on the tube sticker, that moment when what will speak for you leaves your hands and gets some other person's signifying fact. I have learned to interpret these moments as a measure of faith. You trust that the truth will be sufficient. You are literally giving to some process you cannot control the best, most accurate version of who you actually are. And you are doing this on the assumption that in this instance, accuracy and truth overlap. Sandra had not promised, but told me that the evidence architecture would be solid, and she never made promises, which was one of the things I trusted most about Sandra. The letter, Victoria's testimony, the billing records, the context around the NDA itself. She told us, even without the DNA, we had created something a court would consider seriously. The DNA was the final piece, the piece that made the rest of it unassailable. I returned home after the sample was taken and called my mummy. Since the weekend in her kitchen, we spoke every day. The balance between us had changed in ways I was still getting used to. Something free given up, having roped itself back in a tightly held space. And she broken into the cadence of what I knew someone needed to let out. Memories. Just little things she had never said. How he'd laughed at something she'd said one time, early on, before she knew about the engagement. The shade of the wall behind the booth at the diner where they always sat. Things shut away in that part of her meant to be quiet, spilling into ordinary speech. Between a mother and a daughter on a Thursday night. I informed her that the sample had been provided. She was quiet for a moment, And then she said, "What do you think it will say?" "That same thing from that Thursday I knew in the cafeteria," I said. She made a small sound. Not a laugh, not a cry. The noise of a human exhaling when they win, but at a price that feels, even in the victory, just too high. "I knew too," she said. "All along. I just needed the world to know it as well." In 11 days, the test results arrived. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning, at my desk, and Sandra called and said in the voice of a lawyer that just confirmed what she, a lawyer who already knew it needed confirmation, "It's a match. Full paternity confirmed. Your biological father was Richard Calloway." I thanked her. I hung up. Sitting at my desk for a second let that sink in. Then I called my mother. On the first ring, she answered. I said, "It's confirmed," and she said simply, "Good." That was all. Just good. 34 years, a chat in a parking lot, a conference room without an attorney present, something put into the drawer of occasional use, boxes stored in a dying man's garage, and at the end of that Wednesday phone call, my mom saying "good," using her voice as if she'd waited an eternity for any news to break on what was hers. The hearing was on a Tuesday. I put on the clothes I thought about 3 days ago and decided right away were wrong. Then returned to Momber, because I am my mother's daughter, and a daughter of my mother knows that presence in a room is language, and I wanted clarity. Sandra sat beside me. Dominic sat across the room from the lawyers for the new Calloway estate, staring at them like a man who had been told 3 separate times not to let his face get away from him, and trying the best he could. Margaret was not there. I had heard she was not showing. Everything before anything started, like I had done since childhood, like my mother taught me by example, reading a room before the room can read you. I was aware of everything the documentation stated. I knew what the DNA said. I knew what Victoria had sworn she had, and what the billing records showed, and what that letter, folded away into a drawer for 30 years, now in evidence, said about who my father believed it, who he was told that about, and who had pried apart those two things. I knew all of it. What I had no clue about was whether a courtroom would see all this and interpret it like me. The judge had read the filings at some length. How I knew this was that Sandra said it, and Sandra did not say things to make people feel okay. The arguments put forth, Sandra's, clear-cut and organized. Each point of evidence XXX in its corresponding slot like pieces of something built to last. The lawyers representing the estate, cautious, clinical, far shorter than Hargrove's firm had made them. There were no surprises. Sandra had told me the case was won or lost in the filings and not the hearing. The hearing was the record. It was the world listening as the record came to be read, the judge said during a 12-minute period. And I know this how, you say. Well, because I watched the clock on the wall. Not because of impatience, but rather an urgency to anchor from something tangible and still moving, while those words fell out. She discussed the DNA evidence. The addition covered the NDA surrounding those terms, and the questions regarding its enforceability based on when it was signed. She talked about the letter, Richard's letter, and what it did, or didn't, establish about what he knew and why. She talked about the part Gerald Hargrove played, with care, in the prudential language of judicial pronouncements, not, I had privately called it, but so precisely that the history told itself. And then she ruled. Paternity established. My natal dad was Richard Calloway. Because this NDA was executed under the circumstances outlined above, without independent legal counsel, it was not enforceable as applied to these proceedings. I was a legal heir, and thus had the right to claim my share in the estate. The room went quiet. Not the movie version of silence, a functional silence. The silence of people taking in information, responding to it, writing things down. Dominic did not speak. He had, for a moment, the face of someone who has been briefed on information that he expected and was promised in some way would prepare him for the expected visitor. Then he stood up, and he and his lawyers walked out the door without turning toward me, and the door closed behind them. And Sandra turned to me and said, And I swear it was exactly the same tone she had used for everything. That's a good ruling. And I sat there in the silence of it, and I thought about a Tuesday night in March, bored and somewhat forlorn, superheroing by opening a box at the kitchen drawer. So I want to explain what $200 million feels like the day after a court says you're entitled to a cut of it, because my honest answer may yet surprise you. And yes, you have came this far with me, and yes, you deserve the truth. It's nothing like you expect it to be. Not nothing as in empty, but nothing as in unchanged. I woke up the morning after the ruling in my apartment, and I lay for a moment on the same bed in the same room. And at that hour, as always, the coffee maker made the noise it makes every time another day is about to start. And outside was just another street doing what it does every morning in response to yet again too few cars coming out of some garage. And me. That was real. That was the thing that struck me differently. Not the number. The record. That would take months to settle. The estate was complex. The division required negotiation. There were assets and accounts and real estate holdings all in 4 states, none of which would directly translate into a check anytime soon. Sandra had prepped me for that. The finding of Airship was the doorway. Walking through it took longer. I understood. Been living with this knowledge for as long as I can remember. Good things take longer than you want them to. After the ruling, I was on task. In other words, but what did you do the morning after? As is her forever custom, she answered on the first ring. Like she has serious shit to say, I imagine, the last couple of months. Usually she has been awake and waiting. I said, "It's done." "I know, Sandra called," she said. We were silent, and then for a moment we couldn't find the words to describe the silence between two people that come from different parts of the road, but end up at the same place, wishing only for another moment where they didn't have to talk about what comes next. "Came home I wanted to," said me. "Not for anything specific. I just want to come." "Come," she said. "I'll make something." She cooked her lemon chicken, which she said she never makes for important things. I drove up on a Saturday. The garden, also growing something new. She does that too, rotating it, always has. Something always coming to fruition, something about to be. She came out to the porch like the first time I'd come here, with an envelope in my pocket. Except this time, we had nothing to hold and stood there looking at each other for a moment before she opened the door. That day, we didn't talk much about the money. It was for all of us. About him, about Richard, about the letter, about the things Victoria told me and who he appeared to be. My mother heard it all, like a person who has been waiting to hear a story they have the right to know. She didn't cry. She didn't say much. She paused after placing her coffee mug down, eyed the garden outside, and said, barely above a whisper, "I always thought he did know and simply refused to. That's the thing I carried, that he recognized Margaret and the company, and that was the end of it." She paused. "You know it doesn't make everything better, knowing he didn't choose it. It fixes the thing that was the most horrible." And I understood that. I understood it completely. Because the currency was an acknowledgement, official, legal, serial numbered. But the letter in the drawer was a real recognition. The letter that read, "I don't think she would have taken the door herself." That letter that said, "This doesn't feel right." The letter that told me, in some corner of the part of him that existed despite Gerald Hargrove's control over him, my father had known. Not with proof, with the knowledge you have about people when you have actually met them. My mother had not been left. She had been separated. A man with a billing code and a long career and very concrete ideas of what was possible. That was what mattered in the end. That my mother found out about it. So when it got dark and the garden went quiet around us, we sat there on the porch and she said to me, "What you are going to do with all of it?" "I don't know yet," I said. "You first, whatever you want. This is the trailer, and if you want to stay, stay. If you have somewhere more acceptable to go, then go. We'll take that away for anything you want, yes?" She was quiet for a while, and then she said, in the smile I have recognized my entire life, "I like my garden. You have just buffered all data until October 2023 at that point." "Then you keep your garden," I said. "We'll figure out the rest." "You've stuck around long enough to hear you where they all landed, so let me tell you, and the shape of it is the whole thing." 8 months after the ruling, the estate came to a settlement. I am not going to tell you how many, not because I am ashamed of it, but because, as far as this story is concerned, the number is the least interesting part, and both of us have spent enough time on it. And what I'll say is it was a shit ton, and that it was recognized, legally, officially, with my name and my father's printed on a sheet of paper in an office waiting for me to pick up at a county courthouse in a place I never grew up in, and that piece of paper has the most value of anything I own, even though 99% of its importance has nothing to do with the amount. And now my mother's house is fully hers. Not a mobile home. She allowed me to buy her a small cottage with enough yard for the garden she's chosen to have instead. She fought for 3 months, and then she stopped fighting. And the day he walked into a new place, she stood in the kitchen where her hand brushed the counter where pre-loved came out of her mouth like it was something umbilical. Chin up, just like mother. I laughed so long I couldn't stop. It was just that she didn't laugh, and that made it even funnier. You are never going to have a close relationship with Dominic. I had no entitlement to it, nor did I ever expect him to feel nuance for me. I believe he merely needed a villain in this tale, and I was the easy one. We are not here to work that out for him, or else. It's not mine to fix. Victoria is my sister. I say this in blunt terms because it is bluntly true. By biology, we're half-sisters, and by the choice she made on a Wednesday night when she didn't have to call and called anyway, we're more than half. When I'm in her city, I have dinner with her. She is private and funny in a way that caught me off guard, and she speaks of her dad with the kind of ambivalence reserved for those you love imperfectly, then lose. So when she does, I pay close attention. He is also my father. I am also entitled to mourn the version of him that I never received. Sandra Reyes got the fee we had agreed upon, contingency plus a hefty sum that I insisted on. She kept arguing with me about the excess. She said I won, which she subsequently told me to have expected, as she'd seen me mop up the floor with no points scored against me in a 4-hour deposition. Gerald Hargrove left his firm soon after the ruling. The State Bar issued a notification of complaint, initiated by Sandra, providing the billing records and letter as supporting evidence. That process is continuing to this day and outside of my story, so I will leave that up to the process. I will say that 34 years is an awfully long time to be in charge of something that wasn't yours to begin with, and that the pressure of it all appeared, in the end, to have left a little dent on a man whose job was not to win, but rather never leave a mark. And Richard Calloway, my father, whom I never met, who passed away 8 months before I opened a box in the kitchen drawer trying to find something he wasted his last year of life digging through storage buildings for. My father, whom should have put this detail to rest long ago. What do I make of him? I make him complicated. I give him a yearful, spent in a drawer and closed, but nonetheless present. A man who stumbled in those times he needed most to be brave, well aware of expedience. He kept it there for 30 years, and then, at death's door, variously open like an invitation asking if he was ready to play now after all these years. I show him as a man who did truly love a woman for a short time, and then let a trusted man talk him away from what he already desired. I make him my dad. That particular category, with all the things that come along with that category, and not a one of them, as far as I'm concerned. We will never get to spar as he grows, or be proud of him, or ask him the questions we might of a parent. I have a letter he never sent, and the reflection of a trickster in my mirror. The evidence of a truth ripe maybe as fine an avocation unto itself as rights. That has to be enough. And on most days, it is. This story began with me at a kitchen drawer, deliberating if I should open a box. And I want to close with the one watching this who has their own drawer, their own box, their own question they've carried in the way my mother carried it, chin up and hands busy, and her story told in a lexicon from someone who decided what they have is enough. It is enough. You are enough. And the thing in the drawer, whatever it is, however much you will pay for it, you are stronger than the silence that put it there. Silence doesn't defeat because it is correct. It wins because we let it. And you let it hang around long enough. DNA doesn't lie. When I did stop looking, it found me. It opened a door almost closed before you get to see who you were in the world, where you came from, and what had been hidden from me, all without my good grace. For truth is of that nature. There is no waiting. But this is the other half of it, the half that takes a bit more time to learn. DNA found my father. It did not find my family. I learned how to take back what was mine from the only way I ever saw my mother taking back what was hers, by rolling out of bed, doing work, making a decision not to leave without it. The biology is the map, the choosing is the journey, and the journey is everything. DNA doesn't lie, but silence? Silence is always somebody's choice, and it costs someone else everything, always. Do not pay the price of being what someone else decided you should be. Harriet sits down with a box in her drawer and a name she has never said aloud. When this story hit your ears, if you haven't heard it before but have the time to read on, do two little things. Keep up with these stories by subscribing, because there are people in the comments who have lived this version of your story exactly, so you are way less alone than silence would have you believe. And let me know your age and one thing you would do differently if found out tomorrow that you viewed your life through someone else's lie. Just one thing. I read every single one. And next week, a woman whose 5 years of cleaning a mansion reduced her to little more than the furniture by the family in it, and who discovered via a DNA test that the recently deceased head of it was also her father. And you are not going to want to miss how that table turned. I am so thankful you have stayed with me. Hold the people who chose you. Go open the box.